The rain came down in quiet, steady threads, the kind that soaked through collars but didn't demand umbrellas. New York City pulsed beneath it, glass towers shining like silver shards under the gray sky. And among them stood Saul and Trust Bank, a monument of arrogance and wealth, its lobby marble white and cold as the people who passed through it. At exactly 9:37 a.m., Ethan Cross stepped inside. He wore a plain charcoal jacket, not cheap, but unremarkable. His shoes were scuffed at the tips, his hair damp from the rain. To anyone watching, he was just another client with modest needs. The kind of man who'd get polite service but no eye contact. Exactly how he preferred it. The glass doors whispered shut behind him, sealing out the sound of the city. Inside, everything was perfect. The scent of coffee, the faint hum of servers, the muted chatter of finance officers, all wrapped in corporate stillness. He stepped toward the teller line. There were 5 counters open. 4 were occupied by bankers with carefully curated smiles, tapping on their terminals like pianists performing a sterile symphony. And at the far left desk, framed by a golden nameplate, sat Vanessa Reed. Ethan saw her before she saw him. It had been 7 years. 7 years since the night she walked out of their shared apartment, leaving behind a single sentence that would replay in his mind through every sleepless night after. I can't live my life waiting for you to become someone. She had meant it. And she was right. Then. Back when Crosstech Global was nothing more than a sketch on a napkin, a foolish dream scribbled between bills and late notices. But today wasn't then. Today was the day that Dream owned entire divisions of the banking system she worked for. He didn't plan this. He didn't come for her. He came for something simple. 170, cash withdrawal. A test transaction. He could have done it anywhere, online even. But part of him, the part that remembered the echo of her laughter when she called him hopeless, wanted to see what time had done to her. So he joined the queue. The man ahead of him wore a tailored navy suit and a Rolex that caught the light. Vanessa's voice, sharp and melodic, floated across the space. Yes, Mr. Hamilton, I'll expedite the transfer myself. Tell your assistant to expect confirmation by noon. Confident, polished, exactly how he remembered. She looked up when Mr. Hamilton left. Her eyes skimmed over the next client and froze. A single heartbeat of silence. Then her lips curled into a practiced smile. Ethan? He smiled faintly. Hello, Vanessa. There it was, a flicker, a shadow in her expression. Surprise, disbelief, maybe discomfort. But she masked it quickly, slipping into her professional tone. Wow, it's been ages. How are you? Still alive, he said simply. She chuckled, the kind of laugh meant to sound light, but edged with something sharp. I can see that. What brings you here? Opening an account? No, he said. Just a withdrawal. $170. The number hung in the air, small and sad. The customer behind him shifted impatiently. Vanessa blinked, then gave a polite, disbelieving smile. 170, she repeated. As in 170? Yes, Ethan replied. In cash, please. Her gaze flicked over his jacket, his shoes, the faint droplets clinging to his hair. Then she leaned slightly forward, voice low enough to sting. Ethan, are you okay? I mean, I didn't expect you'd be back here for, well, this. He said nothing, just placed his ID on the counter. You're still in tech, right? She pressed, voice casual but laced with condescension. You used to say you'd build something big. I guess it didn't go that way. Her words carried a familiar poison, soft, almost sympathetic, but designed to remind him of every failure she'd ever witnessed. The other tellers had started glancing their way, the rhythm of the lobby slowing. A few customers turned to see who she was talking to. Ethan's voice was calm. It went fine. She gave a little laugh. Well, I'm glad you're getting by. Still chasing those AI dreams? Something like that. Good, she said, typing something on her terminal. Maybe one day it'll pay off. He looked at her then. Really looked. The perfect hair, the designer heels, the subtle tension in her jaw. She wore confidence like armor. But he could see it, the faint hollowness behind her eyes. The kind that came from years of pretending she hadn't made a mistake. Still, he wasn't here to prove her wrong. He was here for $170. The teller next to her whispered something. Vanessa ignored it, continuing her small talk. You know, I always wondered what happened to you. After everything. I kept working, he said. Some things take time. Sure, she said, smiling tightly. But time doesn't always pay the bills, does it? He could have ended it there, walked away, let her win that moment. But something in him, not anger, not ego, just a quiet sense of completion, made him say it. You're right, he said. Time doesn't pay bills, but it buys perspective. She frowned slightly. Meaning, he said, you start to see what really matters. And what doesn't. Her brows furrowed, but before she could respond, the sound of beeping filled the air. It started from her terminal, a sharp, electronic chirp. Then another. Then the low hum of system alerts from the teller stations around them. The floor supervisor's head snapped up. What's going on? Vanessa frowned and clicked rapidly. Her smile faltered. That's odd. My screen's frozen. The teller beside her spoke up. Mine too. It's asking for manual override. Some kind of security lock. Within seconds, the entire bank's rhythm broke. Phones buzzed. A manager hurried out from a glass office. Everyone hold your current transactions. We've got a system-wide freeze. Ethan stepped back quietly, watching as confusion rippled across the room. Vanessa tapped furiously at her keyboard, brow creased. This doesn't make sense. It's showing an inbound transfer. Wait. This can't be right. She glanced at her screen again, reading aloud before she could stop herself. Crosstech Global Holdings, Priority Tier 1 Client, $8, 5 billion asset network. Her voice cut off. Her eyes widened. She looked up at him slowly. For the first time since he'd walked in, Vanessa Reed had nothing to say. The supervisor was beside her now. Who initiated the system trigger? Vanessa's throat tightened. It came through this terminal. It's linked to his ID. All eyes turned to Ethan. He slipped his ID back into his wallet, calm and expressionless. Sorry, he said softly. Didn't mean to cause a disturbance. I just needed my $170. The manager looked pale. Sir, you're the owner of Crosstech? Ethan's faint smile didn't confirm or deny. I prefer to stay off the paperwork. He turned to Vanessa then, their eyes locking one final time. You were right, Vanessa. Time doesn't pay bills. He paused, pocketing his wallet. But sometimes it buys everything else. And with that, he stepped away, leaving her frozen behind the counter, surrounded by flashing monitors and silence thick enough to hear her heartbeat. Outside, the rain had stopped. Ethan walked into the light drizzle, the city unfolding before him, and smiled faintly. He didn't look back. The world remembers success in bright lights, but it forgets the years when those lights hadn't yet been turned on. Back then, before Crosstech, before the skyscrapers and private jets, Ethan Cross lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat that smelled of detergent and broken dreams. His desk was a salvaged door laid across 2 crates. His computer whirred like it was gasping for air. And the only thing louder than the traffic outside was his own conviction that he was close to something big. Vanessa used to believe that too. They met at a charity gala neither of them could afford. She was an assistant banker, sharp, ambitious, and stunning in a red dress she'd borrowed from her roommate. He was the tech intern managing the event's payment software. When the system glitched and the donation records vanished, Ethan fixed it in 10 minutes flat. You just saved them $1 million embarrassment, she'd said that night. No, he'd replied with a grin. I just stopped $1 million panic. She laughed. And he swore right then that he'd make her laugh again for the rest of his life. They moved in together 6 months later. Rent split, groceries shared, dreams interlocked. Ethan coded late into the night while Vanessa studied financial reports by the light of her tablet. They were a team. For a while it worked. But ambition, when fed unequally, grows teeth. At first it was small things, missed dinners, forgotten, anniversaries. The way Ethan would stare at lines of code while Vanessa tried to talk about her day. Just 5 more minutes, he'd say. That's what you said an hour ago, she'd reply. He meant it every time. But every 5 minutes became another night she fell asleep alone. Her promotions came faster than his breakthroughs. While she was being invited to client dinners and dressing in crisp suits. He was patching bugs for apps that never launched. And though she never said it outright, her tone began to change. You're too smart to be wasting time on fantasies, she'd say, setting her wine glass down. It's not a fantasy, he'd argue. It's automation tech that can transform banking security. Ethan, the only thing that transforms banks is money. That one always hurt. She'd roll over, pull the blanket tight, and whisper, I just don't want to struggle forever. The night it ended, rain lashed the city like today. Ethan had just lost his main investor. The funding round collapsed when a competitor leaked early prototypes of his software, months of work gone overnight. When he came home, soaked and silent, Vanessa was already packing a suitcase. I got the offer, she said. Vice manager at Soul & Trust. That's great, he said numbly. When do you start? Monday. In London, he froze. London? She nodded without meeting his eyes. Ethan, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep waiting for something that may never happen. He took a slow breath, trying to steady the tremor in his hands. You said you believed in me. I did. But belief doesn't pay rent. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was tired. The exhaustion of a dreamer who'd stopped dreaming. He stepped toward her, desperate now. Vanessa, it's just one setback. I'll rebuild. I always do. And I'll always be the one paying for the rebuild, she snapped, the suitcase clicking shut. You think I don't notice the bills, the calls, the overdrafts? You're brilliant, Ethan. But brilliance doesn't mean success. Neither does quitting, he said quietly. That line hung in the air like smoke. She looked at him for a long moment, eyes wet but defiant. Maybe not. But at least quitting keeps the lights on. And then she left. No slam. No shout. Just the soft click of the door and the sound of rain swallowing the silence that followed. The months that followed were brutal. Ethan lost the apartment, moved into a sublet with flickering lights and one working outlet. Friends stopped returning calls. Clients ghosted him. Every pitch meeting ended with the same phrase, we're going in another direction. He almost gave up. Once. But failure, he learned, isn't the opposite of success. It's the tuition fee. One night, half awake over his keyboard, he reread Vanessa's last words in a text she'd sent months earlier. You'll never make it big. Ethan, you're too idealistic. He stared at that message until something inside him snapped into place. If she was right, he thought, he'd rather go down trying. That's when Crosstech Global was born, not in a lab or an office. But in that moment of quiet defiance, he built software that could detect financial fraud within milliseconds, a system so efficient that when he demoed it to a private equity firm, they thought he was bluffing. When he proved it live, their skepticism turned into a check with 7 zeros. 6 months later, Crosstech was licensing its algorithm to half the major banks in the U.S., one of them, Soul & Trust Bank. He smiled when he saw the contract name. He didn't have to reach out. Fate had already booked the meeting. When the system freeze happened years later, when her terminal went red and the alarms chimed, it wasn't vengeance he felt. It was closure. Because for all her mocking, her doubt, her disbelief, she had still been part of his story. The failure she represented had forged the man who now controlled the system she once served. And when he walked out of that bank lobby, leaving her stunned behind the counter, he didn't feel triumph. He felt peace. The rain had stopped, just like that night long ago. Only this time, he wasn't watching someone walk away. He was the one walking forward. The sound of rain had become part of the city's rhythm, a soft percussion against glass towers, a soundtrack for ambition. Inside Solon Trust's flagship branch, ambition hummed louder than the rain ever could. The morning rush had peaked. Traders argued over margins. Tellers smiled through exhaustion, and the faint scent of espresso hung in the air like currency for the weary. Behind her glass desk, Vanessa Reed was a picture of poise, or at least the illusion of it. Her lipstick perfect, her blazer crisp, her ID tag gleaming under the LED light. To her colleagues, she was the woman who had it all, the senior officer who climbed faster than anyone else, the one whose laugh was as sharp as her pen strokes. But inside, the laugh had begun to sound hollow. She was reviewing a high-value client ledger when the door chimed and a familiar figure walked in. He didn't look like anyone special. Grey coat, plain shoes, no luxury watch or entourage, but the way he carried himself, calm, composed, almost detached, turned heads. When she glanced up and saw him, her breath hitched. Ethan Cross. The name that still occasionally slipped through her dreams, sometimes in guilt, sometimes in anger, often in confusion. She hadn't seen him in 8 years. And yet, time had been strangely kind to him. His posture had changed. No more slouch from sleepless coding nights. His eyes were sharper, quieter, like they'd seen too much and learned when not to speak. But what startled her most was his presence. It wasn't just confidence. It was gravity. He walked up to her counter like someone who knew exactly where he stood in the world, even if no one else did. "Good morning," he said, voice calm as ever. "Ethan?" She blinked, pretending not to sound surprised. "It's been a while." "It has," he nodded. "I need to make a withdrawal." There it was. That old simplicity. No awkward small talk. No explanations. Just purpose. She raised an eyebrow, fingers poised over the keyboard. "Of course." "Amount?" $170. For a moment she thought he was joking. Then she realized he wasn't. A smile crept up her face, uninvited but impossible to suppress. "You're serious?" Completely. Her colleagues nearby exchanged quiet chuckles, sensing her shift in tone. "You came all the way here to withdraw 170? She said lightly, tilting her head. "I thought you'd be past that." "Sometimes it's the small things that matter most," he said, almost kindly. His composure unsettled her. "You still trying those startup things?" she pressed. "Something like that. You know, Ethan, if you ever need a loan..." She leaned closer, voice soft but sharp. "We have great interest rates for old friends." He smiled, just barely. "No need, Vanessa. I have my own bank now," she laughed. "Of course you do." She turned to the screen, typing his name, more to amuse herself than anything. Then everything changed. Her computer flickered, once, twice. The cursor froze. Then every terminal on the floor glitched in unison. A low alarm chimed. The digital display above the counters turned crimson for a second, flashing a system notice. "Global transaction hold. Authorization pending." The sound rippled through the branch. Confusion. Whispers. A rising tide of unease. Vanessa frowned. Pressing commands. Nothing responded. "That's odd," she muttered. "System's never done this before." "Try checking the corporate vault access," Ethan suggested calmly. She gave him a puzzled look. "Why would that affect your..." Her words trailed off. Because as she navigated the back-end console, a code blinked across the screen. Account ID, CTG 001 registered entity, Crosstech Global Holdings, balance, 8,503,277 412.65. The number didn't compute at first. She blinked, then blinked again, certain she'd misread a zero, or added a few by accident. But the system didn't lie, and at the bottom of the interface, a signature authorization appeared. Account owner, Ethan Cross. The cursor on her screen blinked like a heartbeat. Her mouth went dry. The air in her lungs felt heavier by the second. "What?" What is this? She stammered. Just an old account, he said, voice steady. I wanted to see if your systems could handle it. A tech manager rushed over. We're locking down, ma'am. All international transfers are suspended until this cross-tech authorization clears. Wait, cross-tech? Another officer gasped. The AI security firm?
They own the patent for our fraud firewall.
All eyes turned toward Ethan. He just stood there, quiet, unbothered, as chaos bloomed around him. Vanessa could barely breathe. Her mind flashed through the past 8 years, the breakup, the words she'd said, the disbelief she'd worn like armor. Now that armor cracked. Ethan, she whispered. You own Crosstech? I founded it, he said. But ownership's complicated these days. But the system, this account, the number, it's accurate. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was more brutal than any lecture, any revenge speech, any vindictive triumph. Vanessa's colleagues stared at her, not judging but curious, almost sympathetic. The powerful officer who once prided herself on reading people had missed the biggest investment of her life. All these years, she whispered, staring at her trembling hands. You thought I failed, he said gently. I didn't think. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. That line hit like lightning. He said it without anger. Just quiet truth. She wanted to defend herself, to say you weren't supposed to make it. Nobody believed in you, but the words felt cheap now. She looked around. The entire bank floor had gone still, waiting for him to leave or command. Ethan, please, she started, voice shaking. If I said anything back then, you said exactly what you believed, he said, stepping back. And I'm glad you did. Her eyes glistened, unsure whether from humiliation or realization. Glad? Because if you hadn't walked away, he said softly, I might have stopped climbing. Then he nodded to the manager, who was still frozen near the main terminal. Don't worry. The system will unfreeze in 60 seconds. It's just a security test. And just like that, he turned to leave. The monitors flickered again. The alarm tone softened to green. Business resumed as if nothing had happened, except nothing would ever be the same again. When the glass doors closed behind him, the silence left behind was unbearable. Vanessa sank into her chair, staring at the empty space where he'd stood. Her reflection on the dark screen looked smaller than she remembered. Not the composed banker, not the successful woman, just someone who'd forgotten that kindness was its own form of wealth. She whispered his name once more, but it disappeared beneath the hum of computers rebooting. Outside, Ethan stepped into the clearing rain. The city lights flickered across the wet pavement, gold, white, and red, like reflections of every failure he'd ever endured. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the withdrawal slip, $170 printed neatly across the paper, and smiled faintly. Not because of the money, but because he finally understood something. You don't need revenge on those who doubt you. You just need success loud enough that they hear it in the silence. The next morning, the bank lobby didn't sound the same. Usually, the air was thick with the rhythm of success, clicking keyboards, ringing phones, sharp laughter. But today, there was a hum beneath it, whispered words, half smiles. A name passing between desks like a secret no one wanted to say too loudly. Ethan Cross. Vanessa Reed's name often followed, quieter, sharper, like the echo of a rumor no one dared confirm. She arrived an hour early, but the whispers had already arrived before her. The moment she stepped out of the elevator, conversation halted for a beat. Colleagues pretended to be busy, but she felt their eyes trace her every move. Morning, she murmured, forcing her voice steady. No one responded. Not unkindly, just carefully. She could tell they were still processing what had happened yesterday. How the calm, polite man she'd mocked turned out to be the owner of a company that could freeze their entire financial infrastructure with a single keystroke. By noon, her inbox overflowed, from clients, from regional managers, from PR teams desperate for clarity. Was it a system error? Is Crosstech actually connected to us? Did you really know the founder personally? She didn't answer any of them. Instead, she stared out her glass office window, watching the rain streak down the skyline again, tracing the outlines of the city she'd once thought she owned. Apparently, he didn't just found Crosstech, one co-worker whispered outside her door. He still sits on the board for Atlas Securities. No way. That's half our investment portfolio. Word is, the CEO himself called him sir during the freeze. The voices faded as they passed, but every word carved a deeper groove in her pride. She couldn't blame them for talking. The story was too cinematic to ignore. A forgotten ex-boyfriend walks into his ex-wife's bank, asks for $170, and reveals himself as the billionaire behind their core systems. It sounded made up, except she'd lived it. She replayed the scene again and again in her head, his calm tone, the flicker of lights, the frozen terminals, the number on the screen, 8503-27-412-65. That number haunted her now, not because of its size, but because of what it meant. Every digit was a reminder of the life she could have believed in, but didn't. By afternoon, her supervisor called her in. "Vanessa," said Mr. Lowell, the regional director with a tight smile. "I heard about the incident." "Yes, sir. It was unexpected. Unexpected." He raised an eyebrow. "You were directly involved?" "It was a system hold," she replied evenly, "triggered by Crosstech's own security architecture, which, I understand, belongs to your ex-husband." She flinched slightly at the word husband. "Former," she corrected. "Regardless," he said, leaning forward, "you understand how this looks. The board wants assurance that you weren't complicit." Complicit? Some are suggesting this was a publicity stunt, or a conflict of interest. She stared at him, stunned. "You think I arranged this?" "I think," he said carefully, "that optics are everything. And yesterday's optics were complicated." Her throat tightened. 8 years ago, she'd left Ethan because she couldn't afford another failure. Now, his success might cost her everything she'd built in his absence. "What do you want me to do?" she asked finally. "Clarify your relationship with Mr. Cross, and if possible, secure a statement from him verifying your professionalism during the encounter." A bitter laugh escaped her. "You want me to ask him for help?" "It would go a long way to clearing this up," he said smoothly. "And Vanessa, don't let pride make this harder than it already is." That night, she sat in her apartment, modern, glass-walled, sterile. The kind of place she used to dream about when they lived above the laundromat. But it felt empty now. She poured herself a glass of wine and stared at the city lights reflecting off the glass. They shimmered like unreachable stars, pretty but cold. On her phone screen, Ethan's name hovered in her contacts list. She hadn't deleted it, maybe out of nostalgia, maybe guilt. Her thumb hovered over call. What would she even say? "I'm sorry I laughed at you. Sorry I left when you were drowning. Sorry that I needed you to fail so I could feel like I was winning." She exhaled shakily and set the phone down. She couldn't do it. Not yet. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with her. Her phone buzzed. Unknown sender. "Vanessa Reed. Ethan Cross has requested your presence at Crosstech HQ tomorrow. 9 a.m. sharp. Authorization code attached." She blinked in disbelief. For a moment, she thought it was a cruel joke, until she saw the Crosstech digital watermark. It was real. Her stomach knotted. Why would he ask to see her? To humiliate her again? To finish what silence had started? Or to give her a chance? Sleep never came. She kept pacing, glancing at the clock, rehearsing apologies she wasn't sure she could deliver. By dawn, she looked out at the skyline again. The rain had stopped. The city was washed clean. She wished she could say the same about herself. Crosstech's headquarters was a monolith of glass and steel, towering above the East River, minimalist, intimidating, flawless. Every step she took through the marble lobby echoed like a confession. The receptionist smiled politely. "Ms. Reed, Mr. Cross is expecting you." Top floor. The elevator ride felt endless. Her reflection in the mirrored walls looked unfamiliar, nervous, small. When the doors opened, she stepped into silence. Ethan stood near the panoramic window, back turned, City spread beneath him like a chessboard. He didn't turn immediately. "You came. You asked," she said softly. When he finally turned, his expression was unreadable. Not cold, not kind, just measured. "You're in trouble," he said simply. "I know. The board thinks you orchestrated what happened." "I didn't." "I know." She blinked, confused. "Then why?" "Because I wanted you to hear it from me," he said. "You're not the villain of my story, Vanessa. You were just the lesson." Her throat tightened. "You think I don't regret it?" "Regret doesn't change anything," he said quietly. "But reflection does." He walked closer, his voice softening. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself a better ending." She looked at him then, really looked. Gone was the boy who needed validation. What stood before her was a man who didn't need forgiveness to move forward. Tears welled up despite herself. "Ethan, I was wrong. You were human," he said. "That's worse than being wrong, because it means you can feel it." A pause stretched between them. Long, quiet, and cleansing. "The board needs a statement," she said finally. Forcing composure. "They'll get one," he said. "And so will you." "What do you mean?" "I made a call this morning. You're being transferred to Crosstech Financial Division, head of client ethics." Her jaw fell slightly. You're offering me a job?" "No," he said, almost smiling. "I'm offering you a chance to rebuild the right way." For a long time she said nothing, just stared at the man who'd once begged her to believe, and now believed enough for both of them. "Why?" she finally whispered. "After everything?" "Because I remember what it's like to be dismissed," he said. "And I swore I'd never become the person who enjoyed watching others fall." The elevator chimed softly behind her, signaling the end of their meeting. As she turned to leave, he added one last thing. "You were right about one thing, though." "What's that?" "Money does transform banks, but character transforms people." She left without another word, because sometimes silence is the only language deep enough to hold remorse. This closing chapter ties together the story's emotional arcs: redemption, closure, and poetic calm. Tone: cinematic yet quiet, emotionally mature, reflective rather than dramatic. Pacing: slow, deliberate, and deeply human. Every word designed to let the weight of the story settle. Weeks passed. The storm had moved on, but its echo lingered. Not in chaos, but in change. Vanessa Reed's name had vanished from Saul and Trust's staff registry. Her glass office was reassigned within the hour of her transfer. Some whispered she'd been demoted. Others said she'd been poached by Crosstech. No one knew for sure. The truth, as always, lived somewhere quietly in between. The first morning at Crosstech Financial Division felt different. Gone were the marble floors and forced smiles of her old world. Here, the atmosphere buzzed with purpose. Engineers debating algorithms, analysts running data simulations, people who cared more about creation than appearance. Vanessa had been appointed as head of client ethics, a position that didn't exist until Ethan created it. When she first stepped into her new office, smaller, humbler, with an open window and the faint hum of servers in the distance, she realized something. For the first time in years, she felt useful again. Her first task was to oversee how Crosstech's algorithms handled fairness in financial approvals. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once measured people by their balance sheets. Now she was helping ensure machines didn't do the same. Every day, she arrived early and left late. Not because she needed to prove herself, but because she wanted to understand, and slowly, quietly, the whispers about her began to fade. They were replaced by nods of respect from colleagues who saw her work, not her past. One late evening, the elevator doors opened behind her as she finished a report. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. "Still here?" Ethan's voice asked gently. "Old habits," she said, smiling faintly. He walked to the window beside her. The city stretched below, bathed in gold from the setting sun. For a long moment, neither spoke. "You've done well," he said finally. "I had a good teacher," she replied. "I wasn't much of one." "No," she said quietly. "But you were a lesson." He chuckled softly. "Fair enough." A beat of silence. The kind that doesn't feel awkward, just full. You ever think about the past? She asked. Sometimes, he admitted. Not the pain, just the patterns. The moments that built us. And do you regret any of it? No, he said. Regret is a luxury for people who haven't learned yet. She nodded, eyes glistening but peaceful. You changed, Ethan. So did you. No, she said, shaking her head softly. You grew. I only caught up. He smiled faintly, the same calm smile that once disarmed her and now steadied her. Catching up's still progress. The next morning, she found an envelope on her desk, handwritten, sealed with Crosstech's insignia. Inside, a single note, Vanessa. The world judged us both once, me for dreaming too high, you for stopping too soon. I don't hold that against you. In a strange way, your disbelief gave me direction. Sometimes we don't lose people. We just meet them in the wrong version of ourselves. She sat back, reading the lines again and again, until the ink began to blur through her tears. It wasn't a love letter. It was forgiveness. The purest kind. Unspoken. Unconditional. Freeing. That evening, she visited the old neighborhood where they'd once lived. The laundromat was still there, its neon sign flickering weakly. She stood outside the building, remembering the nights of ramen, arguments, and shared dreams. A child's laughter echoed from an open window above. It reminded her of something Ethan once said. Dreams don't die. They just wait for us to come back mature enough to understand them. She smiled through her tears. She had come back, not to him, but to herself. Elsewhere, Ethan sat in his penthouse study, overlooking the skyline. The world knew him as the genius behind Crosstech, but tonight, he was just a man writing a name on an old check. 170 soron, he folded it carefully and slipped it into a drawer labeled Beginnings. Next to it sat a faded photograph. Him and Vanessa at that charity gala. Younger, reckless, radiant. He studied it for a moment, then whispered under his breath, We were never enemies, Vanessa, just different timelines. Then he closed the drawer, not in bitterness, but in peace. Weeks later, Crosstech hosted its annual conference. Thousands filled the auditorium. Ethan took the stage to announce a new initiative, Project Fairwave, an AI-driven global fund ensuring financial access for low-income communities. At the back of the room, Vanessa watched silently, pride softening her eyes. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. No nod, no smile, just mutual recognition. It was enough. The crowd erupted into applause. Ethan paused just briefly, scanning the faces before him. Then, almost imperceptibly, he looked toward the back and said, Sometimes the people who doubt us are the ones who shape us most. Because belief born from doubt is the kind that never dies. The applause swelled. Vanessa closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. Not as noise, but as closure. Her heart was quiet now. No rivalry. No guilt. Just the soft, forgiving silence of two people who had finally outgrown their past.